I like obsessive characters. I like to scare myself. I like to explore the darker side of one's own nature. I think we all have the capability to commit pretty heinous deeds. Thankfully, we usually don't get into situations where we are called upon to do so, but it exists in all of us, I'm sure. James Dearden, the writer of Fatal Attraction. Fatal Attraction, a 1987 cautionary tale about an affair gone horribly wrong, was an instant hit, generating over $300 million worldwide, dominating the US box office for 8 consecutive weeks, and earning 6 Academy Award nominations. Fatal Attraction was not a cinematic masterpiece. It ultimately failed to win any major awards, even though by this point in time we all know that many award shows are a joke.
Winner is Cher in Moonshot.
The movie's popularity was mainly fueled by the heated debates it ignited around gender roles, infidelity, feminism, and the portrayal of career women, leaving audiences divided over whether the main female lead, Alex Forrest, was a villain or a victim. Something I will be uncovering in this video because this debate still continues to this day, to the point that some people thought it was necessary to make an entire 8-part series from quote-unquote Alex's point of view to finally set the record straight. Spoiler alert, it's pretty bad and unnecessary, and I want those hours of my life back. But let's start from the beginning. In 1979, James Dearden was given £30,000 by the British Film Institute to make any short film he wanted, so he wrote and directed a 40-minute film titled Diversion. Quote, I just wanted to make an inexpensive film. I was sitting at home thinking, what is the minimalist story that I can do? My wife was out of town for the weekend, and I thought, what would happen if a man who has just dropped his wife at the railroad station rings this girl who he's met at a party and says, would you like to have dinner? He has what appears to be an easy one-night stand, but then it all gets ugly. The girl keeps calling, and finally the wife returns and the phone rings again, and the wife picks it up and says hello. And that's the end of the story. It's a little fable about the perils of adultery. It's something that men and women get away with 99% of the time, and I just thought, why not explore the one time out of 100 when it goes wrong? End quote. Diversion raises questions about the ethics of infidelity and the emotional consequences for all parties involved, even though it only gives you a little sneak peek of that. It also offers an unusual perspective by exploring the mistress's side. As she grapples with her own psychological issues, she harms herself in a desperate attempt to make her married lover stay. Somewhere in the early 80s, producers Sherry Lansing and Stanley Jaffe were looking for new projects to adapt into feature films, and they stumbled upon Diversion. Lansing, in particular, was drawn to the story and to the character of the mistress. Quote, I always wanted to do a movie that says you are responsible for your actions. And what I liked in the short film was that the man is made responsible, that there are consequences for him. When I watched that short film, I was on the single woman's side, and that's what I wanted to convey in our film. I wanted the audience to feel great empathy for the woman. End quote. In the following years, Lansing and Dearden struggled to transform Diversion into a captivating and marketable motion picture. In order to emphasize the real consequences of the main character's actions, Lansing felt like his problems needed to escalate, so she proposed adding a pregnancy to the plot.
I said, well, what if she's pregnant? And he said, wait a minute. And then he started to lay out the whole rest of the story.
The screenplay was completed, but it would take another 5 years before it was finally adapted into a film now known as Fatal Attraction. According to Lansing, every studio they approached passed on the film twice because they felt it was about a guy who cheats on his wife for absolutely no reason. Why should people care about him? Even though the fact that there was no reason for cheating was the whole point of the story. Michael Douglas liked the script and quickly secured the role of the main lead, Dan Gallagher, a loving and cheating husband and father. But since he wasn't a huge star yet at the time, the studios were still reluctant to take on this project. Things took a turn when director Brian De Palma expressed interest. The film was immediately approved. However, De Palma did not want to make the movie with Douglas, since he thought that Michael was completely unsympathetic and unlikable. This was proven wrong in the final product. So he issued an ultimatum, and in the end, the producers chose to stick with Michael. Thus, a new search for a director began, and luckily, Adrian Lyne, a British filmmaker known for his expertise in erotic psychological dramas, agreed to direct the film. The role of Dan Gallagher's wife, Beth was given to Anne Archer. This character was supposed to be the perfect wife archetype, embodying beauty, kindness, and domestic harmony, making the husband's affair a reckless and selfish act of impulse rather than a result of any dissatisfaction in his marriage.
He didn't want her to be villainous and, the wife who was the bore or the difficult or the nagger or whatever that was.
Casting the actress to portray the role of the Mistress proved to be more challenging than expected. Many sought-after actresses were simply unavailable, while others gave strong performances but still lacked that certain spark that Alex Forrest had to have. Additionally, a good portion of actresses were reluctant to take on such a controversial role, with some criticizing the story for its portrayal of the other woman. Glenn Close, a 3-time Oscar nominee at the time, was ready for a new challenge. The role of Alex Forrest marked a significant departure from her usual portrayals of loving spouses and maternal figures. Many doubted whether she could embody someone seductive and manipulative, which is quite an unfair and crazy assumption to make about an actor. After all, actors must possess the talent to take on a wide range of roles, yet many get typecast, which is a real shame. Close had to prove herself with a screen test alongside Michael Douglas, and the moment she walked in, dressed in black with her wild hair, it was clear to everyone they had found Alex Forrest. Dan Gallagher, a man in his mid to late 30s, is a successful lawyer from Manhattan. He has a perfect wife, Beth, around the same age as him, and an adorable daughter, Ellen, who is 5 or 6 years old, depending on which parent you ask.
She's only 5 years old. What's she gonna miss? Trigonometry?
Do you have any kids?
Got a 6-year-old girl.
It's possible that the difference in ages was simply an oversight by the screenwriters, since you can find the same inconsistency in the script. The Gallaghers appear to be the picture of an ideal household. You see them comfortably strolling around their house in underwear, all three intimately interacting with each other as a union. Although the creators didn't want to give Dan any overt familial problems that might justify his decision to cheat, you can still make a point that the monotony of family life and the responsibilities of raising a child still affect him. In earlier drafts of the script, Fatal Attraction starts with Dan attending a work party with his wife Beth, where he first meets Alex. After returning home, they make love, demonstrating that they still have time for intimacy despite having a small child. However, the final version changes this scene as the parents get interrupted by their daughter, Ellen, who wants to sleep in their bed. The disappointment on Dan's face is hard to miss.
It's just for tonight, honey.
There's one more moment like this, though it occurs after the affair, where Dan and Beth attempt to be intimate but are interrupted by guests who arrive early for their dinner party. In her book about Fatal Attraction, Suzanne Leonard makes an intriguing observation about Dan's relationship with Beth, suggesting that Dan is infantilized by their marital dynamic, that Beth keeps him on a tight leash. The movie opens with Beth urging Dan to get dressed for his work party, referring to him as a kiddo.
You better get going, kiddo. We're gonna be late.
Later, Beth is the one who decides when it's time to leave the party, signaling to Dan with a let's go gesture, interrupting his conversation with Alex. Even Alex picks up on this and playfully mocks Dan in the moment.
Better run along.
Then at home, Beth reminds Dan to walk the dog before bed.
Aren't you forgetting something?
And the following day, as she and Alan prepare to leave for the weekend, Beth once again tells Dan not to forget about the dog, which appears to be his responsibility.
See, now you're not gonna forget to walk him, are you?
I promise.
Dan eventually forgets to walk the dog because he spends the night with Alex. These interactions seem like typical aspects of married life, likely intended to make Dan more relatable to the audience. My wife is also my mother type of humor. And it works when you watch the movie for the first time. He's a likable hero you root for. But when you take a closer look, these things just make Dan look so incompetent as a husband. There are other scenes meant to humanize Dan, but honestly, they can come off as a bit unimpressive. It's tough to see him as a catch sometimes, and you think to yourself, how did this guy get a wife like Beth? In the first scene, Dan stubs his toe when he tries to answer the phone. Then he gets cream cheese on his nose during a business meeting with Alex. Then he struggles to open his umbrella in the street as the rain pours down. Then he fails to get the waiter's attention at the restaurant where he and Alex take shelter from the rain.
I got a lot of pull here, you know. My favorite restaurant.
I noticed.
And during the cheating, Dan trips while carrying Alex to bed. He's clumsy like that. In the end, Dan's greatest failure, however, turns out to be his inability to protect his own family from Alex and her escalating attacks. As you can see, Dan is certainly no womanizer. In the original short, the man actively initiates the affair. He takes the other woman's number at the party, intentionally avoids traveling with his wife and son to visit family, and instead stays home, calls the woman, and takes her out on a date. Before leaving, he even removes his son's baby seat from the car. The movie version of Dan lacks confidence to make the first move. Dan literally signs in relief after Alex tells him he was good the first time they sleep together. However, when the opportunity presents itself, the movie Dan is the type of man who doesn't hesitate to say yes. By framing the other woman as the initiator and aggressor, even though she isn't that aggressive in her approach at first, the film allows Dan to appear as someone who simply fell into temptation, softening the consequences of his actions and making him a more sympathetic character, which was very important to the executives at Paramount Pictures. As Dearden stated, quote, Paramount said, "How do we root for this guy? I kept getting notes to make him more innocent and Glenn Close's character more ravenous, like he's her victim." End quote. While at the restaurant, Alex and Dan openly flirt with each other, agreeing that they can be discreet and go through with the affair.
I don't think having dinner with anybody's a crime.
Not yet.
Will it be?
Though ultimately, it's Alex who has the final say, as Dan tells her,
I don't know. What do you think?
Oh, I definitely think it's going to be up to you.
I think Dan's insecurity is evident here. He's seeking Alex's approval to move forward. Douglas Kesey, in his paper about erotic thrillers, makes a fascinating remark that Dan finds Alex desirable because she's herself actively desiring. At the same time, in this moment, Dan is mentally shifting the responsibility onto Alex to ease his own guilt about the decision he's making. Is it immoral to get involved with a married man? Absolutely. But Alex has nothing to lose. She didn't make a vow of commitment to anyone. This is supposed to be Dan's first time cheating, but he seems way too casual and cool about it. Some might argue that he's done it before, but it's more likely that he simply believes it's not a big deal as long as it's just sex. But oh boy, will he find out that it isn't. Alex Forrest, a 36-year-old woman, is an editor for a publishing company living alone in a trendy Soho loft. In many analyses and essays, Alex is viewed and described as a successful independent career woman, which leaves some puzzled by her overwhelming emotional obsession with a man. While it's true that Alex is intelligent and assertive, having built a seemingly good life for herself, there are subtle moments in the film that hint at struggles in her professional life as well. Alex mentions she's only been an editor for 2 weeks, hinting at career instability. It's possible that her mental issues, including her tendency to become overly attached or obsessive toward colleagues, forces her to frequently change jobs. Alex is also shown being late for a meeting with Dan, which can come across as unprofessional.
Sorry, I'm late. Just getting the file.
For Dan, Alex Forrest represents excitement and escape from the routine of his domestic life. She's a risk taker, she's fun, spontaneous, and unpredictable. She drags Dan out for tango dancing in the middle of the night after they sleep together for the first time. Later, without hesitation, Alex sexually engages with Dan once again, but this time in an elevator of her apartment building. At the beginning of the movie, Alex is portrayed as a femme fatale, with her curly hair resembling Medusa. The film even acknowledges this during Alex's first appearance at the party.
Looks good, cute.
At first, I couldn't help but feel that Alex was on a mission to teach married men a lesson about infidelity, especially given how often she reminds Dan about his wife.
So where's your wife?
Where's my wife? I'm lucky.
So what are you doing here?
But pretty soon it becomes clear that Alex does it for other reasons, driven by her own emotional instability and deep fear of abandonment rather than any moral mission. The first sign of this appears right after their first night together, when Dan quietly sneaks out of Alex's apartment early in the morning without waking her up. In the early drafts of the screenplay, Dan simply leaves, but in the final version, he places a note beside Alex before going. As soon as Alex wakes up, she immediately calls Dan for reassurance without even checking the bed for the note.
I woke up, you weren't here. I hate that.
I'm not sure about one-night stand etiquette. For some, it's the most perfect scenario because they just don't want to deal with a person after the deed is done, but for others, what Dan does might come off as rude. It's never explicitly stated what is written in the note, but it's something along the lines of,
"Thank you, goodbye, don't call me, I'll call you."
communication beforehand is what's very important, which in Alex and Dan's case never happened. Dan assumes Alex understands the unspoken rules of this affair, but there are two people with completely different perceptions of what's going on. Even though Alex's perception is skewed due to her emotional wounds, it remains her reality. She truly believes in the connection she has with Dan and clings to any signs that reinforce this belief in her mind. During their phone conversation, Alex asks Dan to spend another day with her. He initially declines, citing work and the need to walk the dog, but ultimately gives in, praising Alex's convincing skills, even though it's Dan who is ultimately making the choice to cheat once again.
Yeah, you don't give up, do you? You just don't give up.
Alex and Dan enjoy time together in the park with the dog, listen to their favorite opera, Madame Butterfly, have a homemade dinner, and bond over their strained relationships with their fathers. Alex initially shares that her father died suddenly from cardiac arrest when she was young.
I was 7 years old. It happened right in front of me.
But later, she retracts the statement, pretending it was a lie because she hates when people pity her.
Yeah, he's alive and well and living in Phoenix.
Dan, in contrast, reveals that his own father was emotionally distant, showing him little physical affection.
That's one of the only times I remember my father being nice to me when I was a kid.
Alex is deeply moved by Dan's openness, and this small tidbit of information is enough for her to feel like she understands him on a profound, almost fated level.
It's really strange. I feel like I know you already.
In reality, these people are strangers, and aside from their sexual relationship, Dan offers nothing meaningful to Alex. He could have been John, Chris, or any other man. It wouldn't make a difference. Alex becomes anxiously attached to people regardless of who they are, and you can tell that Alex is trying to make an effort to stay reasonable and act like an adult. She directly asks Dan about the future of their relationship, and he awkwardly tells her that he's married.
I just want to know where I stand.
Alex has a particular tendency to get involved with married men. In a 1988 interview for Vogue, James Dearden revealed, quote, "Originally, I had a long monologue for the other woman in which she explained how much she'd been hurt by her last affair, 7 years with a married man who had promised to divorce his wife and marry her, but it got cut in one of the 9 drafts." End quote. There could be several reasons why Alex is drawn to unavailable men. As the initiator, she experiences a sense of control and power, along with the thrill of doing something forbidden. The attention from a married man can also feel deeply validating. You can only imagine what happened to Alex's childhood after the death of her father. The film gives no insight into what her mother was like or whether a step-parent was involved, but it's possible that Alex also experienced some neglect. She longs to feel special, hoping Dan will choose her over his wife. Alex repeatedly asks Dan about his married life because she's trying to gauge whether he's willing to leave his wife for her. In early screenplay drafts, Alex's behavior towards other women is highlighted. At the start of the story, while sitting at the restaurant with Dan, her dismissive attitude towards the waitress is specifically noted. Quote, "There is a brusqueness in her manner towards the waitress, suggesting a certain lack of empathy with other women." End quote. I also believe Alex struggles with conflicting desires. She craves the stability and comfort of family life, something she likely never had herself, yet simultaneously feels a desire to destroy it for others, perhaps so they can experience the same pain and emptiness she feels. After dinner, Dan and Alex sleep with each other the 3rd time, and as soon as it's done, Dan immediately tries to leave, much like he did before. This time, however, Alex becomes visibly agitated. Furious, she lashes out, tearing Dan's shirt in a desperate attempt to make him stay. Perhaps Alex initially believed she could manage this brief fling and walk away in one piece, but now it becomes clear that she cannot. She realizes that Dan has no regard for her emotional needs, as this was never that kind of relationship. And since she can't do anything about it, of course it hurts.
You thought you'd have a good time. You didn't stop for a second to think about me.
Alex ultimately harms herself not just out of emotional pain, but also to manipulate Dan into staying. Initially, it works. Dan helps her, comforts her, and even spends the night. However, he still calls Beth from Alex's apartment, reaffirming his commitment to his family. Alex overhears this, realizing that Dan will never fully choose her. Some recent reviews and essays I've come across about Fatal Attraction have criticized Dan's behavior, suggesting that he leads on a mentally unstable woman. Although Dan tries to end his affair with Alex after their first night together, he continues to engage with her, calling her honey and baby.
Honey, I'm sorry. My baby, oh.
After her self-harm attempt, when Alex asks if Dan will call her later, he agrees, further blurring the boundaries between them.
Will you call me sometime? You don't have to if you don't want to.
No, I want to.
Later, Alex shows up at Dan's office to apologize for her behavior, and once again, he lies by saying he has been thinking of calling her.
I was gonna call you today.
Dan, however, firmly declines Alex's invitation to go see Madame Butterfly together as a peace offering. But moments later, after they agree to leave the past behind, Dan gives Alex a deep hug and kisses her on the cheek, despite Alex initially offering a handshake. In the script, it's said that Dan found the formality awkward, which is why he opted for a hug and a kiss instead. You can see Alex's face light up with hope, believing she still has a chance to make things right between them. There's some truth to this criticism of Dan's character. He fails to establish firm boundaries with Alex early on. However, he isn't deliberately exploiting a vulnerable mentally ill woman. Alex's mental health issues aren't Dan's responsibility, and he doesn't even fully understand what her struggles are. Honestly, this situation reminds me of how women are often blamed for not saying no firmly to men, especially when they're trying to avoid confrontation for safety reasons. Dan is just trying to be polite and avoid conflict. He's not a villain, just a pathetic cheater. Alex is quite self-aware when it comes to her behavior. She acknowledges that she had a breakdown, and she knows that she has no right to treat people the way she does.
Wanted to say sorry for what happened. I had no right to put you through all that.
After the physical meeting, Alex continues to call Dan at work until one day he finally musters the courage to answer. In their conversation, he even apologizes for any misunderstanding that might have occurred prior.
I'm sorry. I thought you understood. If I misled you in some way, I apologize.
You can't be certain whether Alex would have stopped pursuing Dan if it weren't for her unplanned pregnancy. It escalates the situation dramatically for both of them. On one hand, Alex sees the pregnancy as a way to keep Dan tied to her, with the possibility of him eventually picking her and their child over Beth and Alan. On the other hand, the intense loneliness makes her hope that the pregnancy will give her the chance to create a family and fill the emptiness in her life. Alex reveals to Dan that she had a miscarriage the previous year and believed she wouldn't be able to have kids, so she doesn't want to lose this potential opportunity. Alex tries contacting Dan at work, but when he doesn't respond, she obtains his home phone number and arranges a meeting to inform him about her pregnancy. Dan says a lot of things that show he's trying to dodge responsibility for the affair, first calling it imaginary.
Is this what you want to talk about, our imaginary love affair?
Then questioning whether the baby is even his.
How do you know it's mine?
While it's reasonable for him to ask, after all he knows nothing about Alex, it's clear he's doing it out of denial. As an adult, Dan had a responsibility to discuss birth control and protection with Alex before getting involved with her. Dan does offer to pay for the abortion, but not because he's some sort of male pro-choice female empowerment advocate. He just wants to eliminate the most concrete consequence of his cheating. Naturally, he's stunned when Alex tells him she plans to keep the baby.
We are going to live with this for the rest of our lives.
Dan even goes so far as to break into Alex's apartment, desperately searching for any evidence that might free him from his obligations. Dan disconnects his home phone, making it clear to Alex that he wants nothing to do with her or the baby. As Suzanne Leonard writes in her book, for Alex, the phone becomes a substitute for her voice. Even in moments of silence during her calls, the intrusive ringing asserts her presence and imposes her will. When her voice is silenced by Dan cutting off communication, Alex escalates her actions to ensure she won't be dismissed or forgotten. She shows up at the apartment disguised as a potential buyer since Dan and Beth are trying to sell their city place to move to the country, and Dan is trying to speed up this process. This move serves as a clear threat to Dan. Alex holds the power to reveal the affair to Beth at any moment, and it's also an opportunity for her to obtain the family's new phone number. Dan is, in fact, the first to resort to physical violence in their conflict. He immediately confronts Alex at her apartment. When Alex threatens to tell Beth the truth, Dan snaps, pushing her against the wall and choking her, even threatening to kill her. It's a moment that reveals Dan's growing desperation and fear as he loses control over the situation. Alex still runs to the phone to dial Beth, but ultimately she hesitates and hangs up. Quote, maybe she realizes it would mean the end of her hold over Dan. Maybe she's genuinely frightened of what he might do. At any rate, she suddenly slams down the phone, flings it violently against the wall, and breaks down into uncontrollable hysterical grief. End quote. Alex knew Dan would come to her after what she did. She was waiting for him, determined to look as seductive as possible. She approaches relationships with a teenage-like naivety, believing that if she does X, Y, and Z, the other person will fall in love with her. She thinks it's that simple. When even the pregnancy fails to sway Dan, the overwhelming sense of rejection and disrespect she feels pushes her anger to the breaking point. For Alex, the pregnancy was her last desperate attempt to create a lasting bond with Dan, and his indifference completely shatters her fantasy. She throws acid on Dan's car, then follows him to his new home, where she watches him give his daughter a rabbit as a gift. The sight makes her sick with envy. Later, when the family is away, Alex breaks into the home and kills and boils the rabbit, destroying the symbol of an ideal family she feels she can't have. It's also another chilling warning to Dan, showing him that his attempts to pretend everything is fine won't make her go away. It's an ironic scene since at the beginning of the movie, Alex tells Dan,
I love animals. I'm a great cook.
so she didn't lie about that. Glenn Close initially believed that the rabbit scene was unrealistic for Alex's character and considered it a bit over the top.
I went to psychiatrists because I wanted to understand, number one, is it possible for somebody to have her behaviors, particularly the rabbit? And if it was, what would cause that?
The answer she got was a yes, and the explanation was incest, out of all things.
I was playing a woman who had been incest by her father at a very, very early age and for long enough to really traumatize her.
There's no need to create extreme scenarios to justify Alex's behavior. The movie already provides enough explanation. It's also strange to assume that everyone who does something messed up must have a traumatic background to match their actions. With the shocking death of her father at a young age, Alex experiences the ultimate abandonment, which leaves a lasting emotional scar. Now, decades later, Alex has been given a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder by the viewers and Glenn Close as well. If you were to make the case, Alex does seem to fit the textbook definition of someone with BPD. Her fear of abandonment is a big one, that's for sure. She also experiences intense mood swings and emotional responses, which contribute to her feelings of emptiness afterwards. When Dan declines her offer to see Madame Butterfly, Alex decides not to go and instead spends the day sitting on her bedroom floor, tears in her eyes, flicking the lamp on and off. It's difficult for Alex to control her anger, which often makes her act impulsively, creating instability in her relationships. A key trait of BPD is the rapid switch between idealizing and devaluing others. While, in my opinion, Alex doesn't glorify Dan to that extreme, we see glimpses of this dynamic in the cassette she records for him. She begins by professing the deep connection she believes they share.
I feel you. I taste you. I think you.
But by the end, her tone shifts as she insults Dan by questioning his sexual orientation.
I hate you. I bet you don't even like girls, do you?
Alex's delusional thinking can also be associated with borderline personality disorder, as she often misinterprets situations, particularly in the context of her romantic relationship with Dan. By the end of the film, when she breaks into the Gallagher's home and attacks Beth, she loses touch with reality, convinced she belongs there.
Why are you here?
This behavior reflects another BPD symptom, an unstable or distorted self-image, as Alex desperately wants to replace Beth. It could also be argued that Alex feels incomplete without Dan, as her sense of self becomes dependent on him and their relationship. Looking at Alex through the lens of a specific mental illness like BPD has led Fatal Attraction to face new criticism. Many argue that it portrays people with BPD as dangerous and monstrous. Glenn Close herself has expressed regret about how the character may have contributed to stigmatizing those with mental health issues. However, it's important to note that the film wasn't intended to portray BPD or any mental illness, as the screenwriters likely weren't aware of it at the time. Even Close mentioned that during her preparation for the role in the 1980s, psychiatrists she consulted never identified a specific disorder. They only discussed Alex's trauma. Alex is never diagnosed in the film, and her behavior could be linked to other conditions such as complex PTSD, which is often misdiagnosed as BPD. It could account for Alex's emotional instability, fear of abandonment, and other trauma-related behaviors like self-harm, obsession, boundary violation, and dissociation. For some time, many viewed Alex as suffering from erotomania, a delusional disorder where the individual believes someone is in love with them. While erotomania often involves an obsession with a person of higher social status, it doesn't always fit a single mold, just like any other mental disorder. The key point here is that Alex Forrest isn't meant to represent all individuals with BPD, PTSD, or any other condition. She's a singular character with her own unique set of life experiences. Mental health isn't black and white, and expecting one character to represent every experience is unrealistic. It's common to argue that people with mental illnesses are not violent, and while it's true that the majority aren't, it doesn't mean that mental illness excludes the possibility of violent behavior. Certain mental health conditions, particularly when untreated or accompanied by substance abuse or some additional traumas, can increase the risk of violent behavior. For example, in case of BPD, a person might experience borderline rage, meaning an intense, uncontrollable anger, and this anger can be internal, like self-hatred, self-criticism, or self-harm, or external, like yelling, verbal abuse, physical aggression, or destruction of property. I was genuinely interested in studying research on female stalkers, especially since discussions around Fatal Attraction often highlight that there are more male than female stalkers, which is true. So I guess it means we should stop making movies about female stalkers altogether. Case closed. There's actually pretty limited research on female stalkers, especially since female criminality is often overlooked. In their 2001 study, Purcell, Path, and Mullen pointed out that male victims of female stalkers often face indifference or skepticism from law enforcement. Meanwhile, female victims can have their sexual orientation questioned. Interestingly, male stalkers tend to be prosecuted more frequently, showing a gender bias in how these cases are handled. Dan faces this bias when he asks for help from the police.
Well, you saying he just has to sit there and take it?
It's his bet. I'm afraid he's gonna have to lie in it.
But another interesting fact is that stalking laws didn't even exist in the United States when the story of Fatal Attraction was created. The first anti-stalking law was passed in California in 1990. In some states, adultery is technically illegal, although it is rarely prosecuted. So Dan's cheating probably wouldn't have landed him in trouble. Meanwhile, Alex, despite no stalking laws, could have been charged for property damage, kidnapping of a child, and animal cruelty. So her actions definitely have more severe legal implications. Based on available studies, female stalkers are usually single, heterosexual women in their mid-30s, often without kids, educated, and mainly Caucasian. Many show signs of mental illness, including delusional disorder and borderline personality disorder, which surprised me. Even with incomplete data, there is a noticeable rate of sexual and physical abuse in the backgrounds of female stalkers, possibly predisposing them to BPD or PTSD. Malloy and Boyd, in their 2003 study, collected data on 82 adult women who had engaged in stalking behavior via a survey sent to mental health and law enforcement professionals in the United States, Canada, and Australia. Even though the sample was small, there were some fascinating findings. Common emotions driving female stalkers include anger, obsession, rage at abandonment, loneliness, dependency, jealousy, and perceived betrayal. Most victims are known to their stalkers, friends, ex-lovers, members of family, but about 20% are complete strangers. Typical stalking behaviors include phone calls, sending messages, gifting letters, driving by, trespassing, and following. More than half threatened their victims, and about a quarter were physically violent, with 3 victims losing their lives. Most violence didn't involve weapons and didn't result in injuries, but it was more likely if the stalker and victim had a sexual history. A 2014 study examined stalking in same-sex and opposite-sex scenarios, surveying 872 self-identified victims from the UK and the US. It found that female stalkers were more likely than male stalkers to abuse their victims' pets, especially if the victim was also female. As for threats of sexual assault, those were mostly reported by victims of male stalkers. Not surprising, of course. Overall, this fact suggests that Alex Forrest embodies a well-rounded depiction of a female stalker, and it's not in any way unrealistic in my opinion. Dan doesn't tell Beth about Alex until the bunny gets boiled, and by then it's already too late because things start affecting Beth and Ellen directly. Instead of being honest from the start, Dan lets things escalate. The first person he confides in is his friend. Then he goes to the police, and only after running out of options does Dan finally tell Beth, who has no choice but to step in and protect her family.
If you ever come near my family again, I'll kill you, you understand?
Beth Gallagher is portrayed as the ideal wife and mother. She's kind, patient, caring, social, and fully dedicated to her family, to the point that it seems like her identity doesn't exist outside of it. Especially if we talk about the movie, because in the original screenplay, Beth was a teacher who had taken time off to raise her daughter, and after finding her dream home, she expressed her desire to have a second child. The fact that the movie version of Beth is solely a stay-at-home mom is what sparked the view that the film intended to create a sharp contrast between the career woman and the traditional mother, so Alex and Beth. In her book about Fatal Attraction, Suzanne Leonard analyzes the color palettes used for the Gallaghers compared to Alex. She notes how the warm, usually orange and brown tones surrounding the Gallaghers reflect their familial harmony and happiness. The spaces they're in are always cluttered with toys and clothes and family pictures, creating a cozy atmosphere. In the opening shot, they're all dressed in white, emphasizing the sanctity of their family unit. That's why the white rabbit, with its tragic fate, works so well as a symbol of this. Interesting fact, in the earlier drafts the bunny was black. Alex in turn often appears in cool blues. Even though there's a lot of white, she has an all-white apartment, and she appears numerous times in white, this color is associated with her cold, lonely existence. When you see Alex lying in bed after her self-harm attempt, it looks almost clinical, like she's in a hospital bed. The Gallaghers, on the other hand, also have white sheets, but theirs are decorated with lace, ruffles, and a comforting blanket on top, making their space feel warm and inviting. White is not the only color Alex wears. She also appears in black as frequently, symbolizing the duality of her character, her good and evil sides, her vulnerability and self-destruction. To create Alex's space, director Adrian Lyne researched the way apartments of single women in the publishing business looked like. Quote, "They were a little sad, if you want me to be honest. They lacked soul." End quote. He also shared his opinion on career women, which can be viewed as sexist. I couldn't find the original sources, but these quotes are well documented in Susan Faludi's book Backlash, where she critiques Fatal Attraction and similar media for contributing to the backlash against feminism in the 1980s. Adrian Lyne said, quote, "They're sort of overcompensating for not being men. It's sad, you know, because it kind of doesn't work. You hear feminists talk, and the last 10-20 years you hear women talking about effing men rather than being effed, to be crass about it. It's kind of unattractive. However liberated and emancipated it is, it kind of fights the whole wife role, the whole childbearing role. Sure, you got your career and your success, but you're not fulfilled as a woman. My wife has never worked. She's the least ambitious person I've ever met. She's a terrific wife. She hasn't the slightest interest in doing a career. She kind of lives this with me, and it's a terrific feeling. I come home and she's there." End quote. Susan Faludi also quoted Michael Douglas, who said that he was tired of feminists, and James Dearden, who remarked that an ambitious career woman might be appealing for a fling, but not as a long-term partner since it would create competition within the relationship. To really understand the cultural context behind Fatal Attraction, it's important to look at the bigger picture of what was happening in American society at the time. The movie came out during a period when there was some pushback against the feminist gains of the 1970s, which were the legalization of abortion, increased access to education and workplace rights. When Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980, it marked a clear shift towards conservatism, with his administration promoting traditional family values and emphasizing women's roles as wives and mothers. Susan Faludi's backlash, The Undeclared War Against American Women, was a critical take on how the advancements from second-wave feminism were met with resistance during the 80s. She focuses on how media, politics, and culture often tried to roll back the progress women had made, portraying independent women as unfulfilled or even threatening, and Fatal Attraction, in her opinion, is a good example of it. Portraying Alex Forrest as an unhinged career woman, the movie reflected the societal fears about the women who stepped outside of the traditional family role. For example, Alex emphasizes that at age 36, it might be her last chance to have a baby, a sentiment that reflects the rhetoric directed at women in the 1980s, when the phrase biological clock gained popularity in discussions about female fertility. The idea that a woman's biological clock was at its limit often centered around age 30. Interestingly, in the earlier drafts of the script, Alex Forrest was only 32. Being 36 years old, according to today's standards, is not too old to start a family. However, it's important to acknowledge that biologically speaking, after age 35, the risk of pregnancy-related complications does increase, and as women get older, they face greater challenges in conceiving. Similarly, men experience a decline in sperm quality as they age. But unlike men who continually produce sperm for their entire life, women do have a more defined and limited window for fertility due to the finite number of eggs and the biological processes of menstruation and menopause. Nowadays, there's a more nuanced understanding of fertility, and with the aid of reproductive technologies and prenatal care, couples can conceive healthy babies in their 40s. But in the 1980s, women were often unfairly held solely responsible for infertility issues, with all the blame placed on their shoulders. It's really important to encourage women to make their own choices about reproductive health without feeling pressured by society, whether that's rushing to have babies too early or waiting too long and facing potential complications. Having said all of this, American women were still making huge progress in the 80s, and it wasn't all that depressing. More women were getting college degrees and entering the workforce in larger numbers. Women were breaking into male-dominated fields like law, business, and politics, and media began to reflect that reality as well. You can argue that Susan Faludi selectively focuses on films and media that portray career women negatively, while overlooking those that offered more positive representations. You really need to watch a wide range of movies from the 1980s to provide a thorough analysis. Overall, the 80s were a confusing time for women in America. The idea of having it all felt like a double-edged sword. On one hand, it motivated women to chase their dreams and break barriers, but on the other, it set up unrealistic expectations that left many feeling overwhelmed. The struggle to balance career and family was a huge challenge back then, and honestly, it's still one of the biggest issues women face today. The writers and producers of Fatal Attraction of course denied targeting career women, insisting that Alex shouldn't be seen as a representation for all women and that her career is not a defining aspect of the story. She has it because it's difficult to survive without one, especially in New York.
I never thought of her as representing every single working woman.
But nobody can deny that the executives at Paramount wanted Dan to appear more likable and sympathetic, which ultimately undermined the original message that every action has consequences. Dan's likability is achieved at the expense of Alex. The crazier she appears, the more sympathetic he becomes. Some audience members laughed while watching Dan trying to cover his tracks after spending the whole weekend with Alex. He makes the bed look messy to fake sleeping there and feeds the spaghetti Beth left for him to the dog. This is actually the lowest of the low, eating your mistress's spaghetti instead of your wife's.
I remember Sherry says, I can't believe this. Like they've forgiven you already.
That's how sympathetic Michael Douglas is.
Dan never explicitly confesses to his affair on screen. He never says the words out loud. Even when he's ready to come clean, it's Beth who has to drag the truth out of him.
What is it? Do you have an affair with her?
Yes. It was one night. It didn't mean anything.
When later Dan calls Alex to tell her it's over,
It's all finished. I told Beth. She knows all about it.
He hands Beth the phone, and like a mother shielding her child, Beth protects Dan from an angry and scary monster. Dan is shown grappling with some guilt and remorse. He starts tearfully gazing at his family because the affair gives him this brand new appreciation for them. When Alex kidnaps Ellen and Beth gets into a car accident searching for her daughter, Dan comes to visit her in the hospital, and the only thing he says,
You'll be okay.
this would be a good cliché moment for Dan to say, this is all my fault, it's all happening because of me, but he doesn't. He cries though, and it does demonstrate without words that he feels sorry, but we don't know for what. Is it his fear of losing Beth, or is it about his guilt? It's just clear that the movie is walking on eggshells around the topic. And what does Beth do? She smiles at him. After a near-death experience, it's natural for someone to gain a new perspective and reevaluate what really matters. In those moments, something like an affair might seem trivial in comparison, but towards the end, the movie rushes through everything so fast that it feels like Dan is forgiven way too soon, without really addressing the emotional weight of his betrayal. When Beth finds out about the affair, her pain feels so raw and real. For the majority of the film, she seems calm, collected, and understanding, but the rabbit scene is where we first hear her really scream, like it unlocks this flood of emotion. I honestly didn't expect Beth to get so loud and furious with Dan. She tells him to get out.
I want you out of this house! I want you out now!
I thought the movie might hold back and not let Beth be fully enraged, but it does, just not for long. What's interesting is that as Beth is yelling, Dan keeps saying, let me explain, just listen. But we never actually hear his perspective on why the affair happened. In the script, however, he does explain it, not to Beth, but to his friend. Beth probably wouldn't have liked this explanation. Jimmy, listen, Dan, can I ask you something? I'd really like to understand. I know you. You don't F around. Why did you do it? Dan, that's funny. She keeps asking me that. If I'm so happy, how come I went home with her? All I can think of is a combination lock. You know, all the tumblers have to fall into place. If I hadn't been married 10 years, click. If I hadn't gone to that weekend meeting, click. If Beth and Ellen hadn't been in the country, click. If she hadn't been at the meeting, click. If it hadn't been raining so hard, if she hadn't been so attractive, click, click, click. You know, I think everyone's got some combination that will open them up, that can unlock them. Dan's answer reflects his internal conflict and hints at his struggle with commitment and responsibility. It presents the morally gray nature of his character, which the movie tries to suppress as much as possible. In early drafts, after Beth kicks Dan out, he calls to check on her, making excuses to shift the blame, saying things like, I'm sorry, please don't let this destroy us, and suggesting they meet. When Beth declines, Dan simply replies, okay, call me when you change your mind. And then the car accident happens. This is already bad enough, but in the movie it's even worse. Dan is such a coward that he doesn't even talk to Beth directly. He talks to Ellen instead, telling her to inform Mommy he called. This clearly shows Dan's tendency to dodge conflict. After the kidnapping of his daughter and his wife's car accident, Dan does come to Alex's apartment ready to physically attack her. However, at the last moment, he refrains from choking her to death. This moment paints him as a better person, especially in contrast to Alex, who immediately charges at him with a knife, clearly intending to harm or even kill him. Ultimately, Dan manages to disarm Alex, leave the scene, and go to the police. Beth gets discharged and then comes back home to help her out because her arm is broken. Once again, they exchange smiles, indicating that there is little tension between them. In a drawer, Dan checks a gun without any context about its origins. He also locks the doors, but it's pointless because Alex is already inside. This is his first mistake. Then he fails to hear Beth's screams when Alex attacks her, and when he finally arrives at the scene, he doesn't bring the gun with him. Instead, he tries to choke Alex with his bare hands, and once again, he fails. In the end, Beth grabs the gun and shoots Alex right in the chest. Dan walks away completely free, while Beth transforms from a victim into a killer, forever marked by blood on her hands that can never be washed away. While Beth's transformation isn't fleshed out, she evolves beyond the stereotypical wife and mother role. She reveals emotional depth, inner strength, and resilience in the face of betrayal and danger. It's fascinating how Alex and Beth share physical similarities, particularly with their puffy hairstyles. You can say that the two women reflect the Madonna-Mistress dichotomy, but at the same time, I think it's unfair to categorize these two female characters into two simplistic opposing roles because they're way more complex than that. Both Alex and Beth are capable of crossing over into each other's roles, blurring the lines between good and bad. What some people didn't like about Alex's character is that she appears to yearn for the traditional roles of mother and wife. This desire is often interpreted as a critique of the belief that pursuing a career inevitably leads to unhappiness, a sentiment that was especially common in the 1980s. However, looking at Fatal Attraction through a modern lens, it becomes clear that Alex's aspirations are quite common. When someone is dealing with mental health issues, it's common to just want to feel normal. This often means wanting friends, a life partner, and a family, because maintaining relationships can be really tough. Alex frequently talks about respect, especially after discovering her pregnancy. She seems to believe that achieving this respect is inherently tied to her becoming a mother, as if motherhood is the key to validating her worth and identity.
I'm going to be the mother of your child. I want a little respect.
On one hand, the movie clearly paints Alex as unfit for a motherly role, boiling a helpless animal, kidnapping Alan, and taking her to ride a roller coaster that seems to be inappropriate for both of them. All show Alex as reckless and clueless about childcare. I think the creators behind Fatal Attraction missed the fact that you are not supposed to ride roller coasters while pregnant. The amusement park scene mimics the bunny boiling scene to a T, so it's there to create the tense atmosphere. There was one more scene that didn't make it into the movie because the child actress who plays Ellen had short hair. When Alex drops Ellen off, she's supposed to cut a chunk of her hair, which is such a cartoon villain move. Luckily, it didn't make it into the final cut. On the flip side, Alex does show some nurturing qualities. She keeps her apartment neat and tidy, cooks a nice meal for Dan, and even rushes to his aid when she mistakenly thinks he's having a heart attack, showing genuine concern. All of these things hint at Alex's capacity for care. These moments reveal that she isn't entirely without warmth or the potential for nurturing. And in the original script, instead of the creepy roller coaster, she takes Alan to a coffee shop for ice cream, trying to befriend her before dropping her off without cutting a chunk of Alan's hair as well. Now, if you look at Beth, despite her motherly, calm exterior, she shows she is capable of channeling some of Alex's more intense traits. Beth doesn't just stay composed. When pushed to her breaking point, she can get just as loud and confrontational, and the film's climax shows that she has the capacity for violence too. Beth doesn't just kill Alex, she also ends the life of Alex and Dan's unborn baby, which drastically contrasts with her motherly nature. Quote, "In the film's final scene, Beth rubs steam off the bathroom mirror until there can be seen her face and Alex is behind her, as if Alex were a side of Beth's own self she was just discovering." End quote. The film wraps up with Beth and Dan embracing before moving into another room. As they do, the camera focuses on a photo of their seemingly perfect family. The end. This ending gets interpreted in two ways. On one hand, it suggests a hopeful reconciliation, implying that the family is going to be rebuilt, so in this case, Dan doesn't lose anything at all. He just has a couple of scratches. And on the other hand, as James Dearden and Adrian Lyne have mentioned in many interviews, it's ironic. It hints at a haunting darkness that now hangs over the family, indicating that they will never truly be the same, and it's uncertain if Dan and Beth are going to survive this. However, this was not the original ending envisioned for the story. In James Dearden's initial script, right after having the second physical fight with Dan, Alex ends her own life the same way Madame Butterfly does in the opera, and she manages to succeed in framing Dan for her murder because his fingerprints are still on the knife that he took from Alex during their last fight. The final scene shows Dan screaming about his innocence in prison. This ending represents a worst-case scenario, but it aligns perfectly with the message that all choices come with consequences.
At that time in my life, I absolutely loved it, that your actions, have consequences. But Stanley and Michael always hated that ending.
This ending was deemed a bit too extreme, so a slightly more forgiving version was created. In this ending, Alex still takes her own life with a knife. The police then show up at Dan's home to arrest him due to the found fingerprints. Dan tells Beth to contact one of his co-workers. And while looking for Dan's address book, Beth finds the tape that Alex has made for her husband, where she threatens to end her life. This lets the audience know that Dan will ultimately be cleared.
You're my last chance, Dan. I can't live without you.
This ending just reaffirms Beth's role as the perfect wife and mother, which is okay, but less interesting. But it fits better with Alex's character arc. It ties together the Madame Butterfly theme, the opera with which Alex identifies, as it's about a woman who takes her own life after being betrayed and abandoned by her lover. It also explains why the movie lingers over the knife on Alex's kitchen counter. And it forces the audience to reconsider the story from Alex's point of view to some degree. Test audience hated this ending, they wanted Alex's blood. Later, during the real theatrical screenings of Fatal Attraction, there were reports of some men in the audience shouting things like, "Kill the bitch," laughing at Alex at her most vulnerable moments. This behavior speaks volumes about the social climate towards gender issues in the 1980s America. Nobody wanted to write and shoot a new ending. Adrian Lyne was against it, but then Paramount provided additional funds with no strings attached.
Ned Tannen came to us and he said, shoot the ending that satisfies them. And if you don't like it, you don't have to use it.
Glenn Close was the last to be convinced because she felt a strong sympathy for her character, fearing that altering Alex's fate would reduce her complexity to that of a simple villain.
When I heard that they wanted to make me into basically a psychopath rather than somebody who was self-destructive and basically tragic, it was a profound problem for me.
When the audience reacted favorably to the new ending, the filmmakers got convinced that the original was flat and lacked catharsis. The focus shifted away from the underlying message, and many viewers seemingly forgot that Alex was even pregnant. Decades later, people still think that Alex lies about her pregnancy, even though there's no proof in any script that she does. And this is all because the movie never acknowledges it at the end. Both endings result in the pregnancy early termination. Alex's brutal double death in the final ending feels really cheap and over the top, like something out of a slasher movie. The original ending does feel less cathartic and a bit flat. But it's probably because Fatal Attraction would have worked better as a psychological drama instead of a silly thriller that flirts with horror. It would have given the characters more room to evolve, revealing that no one is purely right or wrong. By confining themselves to the thriller genre, the filmmakers prioritized suspense and entertainment over the more nuanced social commentary. Interesting fact is that Japan was the country that kept the original ending of Fatal Attraction because people really liked it. It's always fascinating how audiences in different countries react to the same art, revealing how personal experiences and cultural backgrounds shape our interpretations. Fatal Attraction's ability to inspire many readings is what made it so successful. And despite the mess behind the production and American social climate in the 1980s, Alex Forrest stands out as an iconic and multifaceted female character, with her fiery quotes resonating through time.
You mean you've had your fun, now you just want a quiet life? Whole means complete. If your life's so damn complete, what were you doing with me?
Because I won't allow you to treat me like some slut you can just bang a couple of times and throw in the garbage. I'm not going to be ignored, Dan.
Victoria Smith, author of Hags, a book about the demonization of middle-aged women, made this point about Fatal Attraction. Quote, "I think Fatal Attraction tapped into the sex positivism that would be such a big thing in the 1990s. It was a kind of zipless F film. The good feminist, the true feminist, was supposed to sleep around and not get dragged into wanting a relationship. The message was, you mustn't catch feelings. You didn't want to be that kind of stalker woman. Women were under pressure to embrace that narrative, and we were torn, because what if you did catch feelings?" End quote. A Fatal Attraction TV reboot was announced in 2021 and finally arrived in 2023, starring Lizzy Caplan as Alex Forrest and Joshua Jackson as Dan Gallagher. Now, I won't spend too much time comparing it to the original. I know this video is too long and nobody cares, but I still need to vent a little bit because I wasted my time with the show. If you haven't seen it and you want to watch it, beware, huge spoilers ahead. The show was cancelled after one season, and yes, they were hoping to squeeze out a second. What's funny is that even in 2023, Alex Forrest gets murdered, and her pregnancy, well, that's written off as a false positive. Nobody gives a damn about this poor baby. The show's main goal was to humanize Alex, giving her more depth and perspective. And sure, the show did that by showing the same scenes over and over from Dan's, Alex's, and Beth's perspectives. It's like the show is desperately trying to teach you empathy, but it just ends up feeling repetitive. Somehow, Dan still takes up the most screen time, and there are a bunch of added side characters that you don't care about. Back in the 80s, everyone was obsessed with thrillers. Now, in 2023, we are obsessed with true crime and murder mysteries, and this is what the show is. The filmmakers were primarily focused on keeping the suspense high and packing in as many plot twists as they could. They set it in modern times when Dan is getting released after being in prison for 15 years for Alex's murder, but it's unclear if he did it or not. So you jump between 2008, when him and Alex had an affair, and 2023, when he's dealing with the consequences of his actions. And the only way you can tell that it's 2008 is by Joshua Jackson's curls. and Beth's banks, I guess. And as the episodes progress, time jumps become a guessing game. 15 years in prison might actually seem like a decent form of self-care, considering Dan doesn't appear too bothered by the fact that he was locked up for something he didn't do, because the modern audience now wants to see him being unreasonably punished, from one extreme to another.
You don't matter in this building anymore, you entitled mother.
In the end, a family friend kills Alex because his wife has cancer or something, and he also feels sorry for Beth. When the wife dies, him and Beth actually get together. Because it's modern times, the show leans heavily into mental health discourse. Ellen, now grown, studies psychology. Nobody is diagnosed directly, but the filmmakers and actors reveal that Dan is a clear case of a narcissist, the most popular term nowadays, and Alex has BPD, but they didn't want to make it explicit. Hilariously, even Alex's therapist can't deal with her, like she's that bad.
I can actually tell if you're mad at me or not, so I don't know why you wouldn't just
Take care of yourself.
Seriously, she's way colder, more distant, and gives off killer vibes compared to the original Alex. There is no duality. And as for the iconic bunny scene, it's gone, but the bunny does make an appearance as Alex's neighbor's pet. In a random moment, Alex kicks the poor thing and calls it a C word. No idea why. At least in the original, there is a clear reason she targets the bunny. Alex does kill someone though, Beth's mother. She helps her drown. But this dark twist is quickly brushed aside and forgotten like it didn't happen. The final kicker is the final plot twist. Ellen, now an adult, has inherited some creepy stalker tendencies, all thanks to the few hours she spent with Alex as a child. The end.
Are you mad at me?
This idea that every fictional character requires an elaborate backstory, a detailed psychological profile, or traumatic history to justify their actions needs to die. Thank God the show just gives Alex an emotionally abusive and unpredictable father instead of something like incest. Sometimes ambiguity, mystery, or simple human complexity are more compelling. Alex Forrest is either viewed as a scary villain or a tragic victim you're supposed to feel sorry for. But that's a simplistic view. People are complex, and so is Alex. She's both. She isn't purely evil, nor is she just a victim of her circumstances. I don't understand how we can talk about gender equality while believing that women are incapable of violence. We can acknowledge that some of Alex's actions are undeniably villainous, not merely due to mental health issues, but because she consciously chooses those actions. At the same time, you can invite empathy without excusing her behavior. We can recognize that some of these choices stem from deeper emotional struggles. It's important to allow her to exist in shades of gray, rather than forcing her into rigid boxes of villainy or victimhood. However, I firmly believe that we should also let female villains be villains sometimes, because there are all kinds of women in the world, so there should be all kinds of female characters in art. Quote, I actually think the film is like one of those Rorschach tests beloved of psychologists, where you're invited to interpret an ink blot. People, especially passionate advocates of one cause or another, will always see what they want to see, even subconsciously, finding meaning where it may not exist, offense where it wasn't intended. So my answer is that Fatal Attraction is in the end just a story, and a pretty simple one at that. End quote.